Joining me on the program now, Professor of International Relations at the University of Otago, Professor Robert Patman. Robert, kia ora, nice to see you again.
Kia ora, Andrew. Nice to see you.
This is a step, certainly a strong show of unity within the UN, 142 in favour, 10 against, most prominently, of course, Israel and the United States. A few abstentions, but a strong statement from the UN.
Yes, and just in the last 12 hours, there's been a very important vote in the UN Security Council. There was a resolution tabled by the 10 elected members of the UN Security Council. Unfortunately, it was vetoed. The resolution, it was vetoed by the United States, but the voting was striking. There was no abstentions, and close allies of the United States, such as Britain, voted for it. And the resolution called for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages immediately, and the lifting of all restrictions on the distribution of humanitarian aid. So that is the context. And I watched some of the discussions that occurred in the UN Security Council, and there is a feeling now, I think, in the UN that the US and Israel is pretty isolated.
Yeah.
And so New Zealand is one of those countries that has been weighing up whether to grant recognition to a Palestinian state. We know that Britain, Canada, and France have already committed to doing so.
Yep.
I think the events of the last 12 hours have probably accelerated the process in which a country like New Zealand will join in that process. You mentioned some of the difficulties. It's difficult, on one level, you could argue, well, what's the point of granting the Palestinians a state when, first of all, there's conflict going on in Palestinian territories, and secondly, it's very difficult to envisage how the state would function given that situation. But the three territories which the Palestinians want to form a state from have been under occupation since 1967.
Yeah.
And so they would argue it's never a good time, but until they get formal recognition, there is no prospect of it happening. In other words, countries, until they actually take that symbolic step of saying, yes, the Palestinians should have a state, and it's now the overwhelming majority of countries, that in a sense does put pressure on those saying, no, they shouldn't, because it makes them, the parties denying the prospect of a Palestinian state. Of course, part of the UN Charter guarantees the right of political self-determination for nations. So I think it ups the pressure on those denying the prospect of a Palestinian state. It's no secret that Mr. Netanyahu has made his career in the democracy of Israel denying the prospect of a Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. He parted company, for example, from the leadership of Israel in the mid-90s. Mr. Rabin, who was tragically assassinated, had come round to the view that the best long-term security of interests of Israel was to recognize the prospect of a Palestinian state. Mr. Netanyahu disagreed and has since been, much of his career has been dedicated to prevent that prospect. So there is, I think one of the things that's been weighing heavily on New Zealand's decision-making, quite apart from the fact that the Trump administration will be upset about it, is what practical difference does it make? But the other side of that question is, well, is it better than doing nothing?
It is.
Politics is. Sorry.
No. I was just going to say that the UN this UN resolution, or at least the General Assembly endorsing the New York Declaration. We're not quite at the point. I mean, it's coming up shortly, but later this month, New Zealand will need to make the decision, fish or cut bait, on this one. Given the US permanent position on the Security Council will never agree to this. Could there be a Palestinian state without the US's approval and without Israel's cooperation? Is this a theory that can never be put into practice, given these two facts?
Well, I think at the moment the UN Security Council is in deep trouble, and there is enormous concern that one country can virtually determine matters of peace and war in the world. And that's not what the UN Security Council was set up for. New Zealand's been a long-standing opponent of the veto system, going back to Peter Fraser, who played a key role in drafting the Charter, former New Zealand Prime Minister, between 1940 and 1949. Mm-hmm. And so I think the events in the last 12 hours, the US, once again, for the sixth time, has blocked a ceasefire. What concerned me watching the US representative was some of the factual errors in the presentation to the UN Security Council. Also, the fact that the United States is denying the Palestinian Authority's representative, Mahmoud Abbas, the prospect of physically attending. Critics point out that that is actually not within the United States right. The United States hosts an international organization. Yeah. But it doesn't mean it can pick and choose who participates in the discussions.
Of course, UN headquarters
not under the headquarters agreement.
No, but the headquarters are, I suppose, on US territory, so it's complicated in that regard. Some people would say that the moves in the US are setting back the prospect of peace in Gaza, but there didn't seem to be any light on the horizon anyway, honestly.
Well, I think, quite frankly, the problem is, and many Israelis take this view, that the far-right coalition government led by Mr. Netanyahu, they've made no bones about it. They don't want a Palestinian state. They also want to annex the West Bank. I mean, they publicly said this, and they all continue to expand the settlement process. Palestinians have been evicted from their homes, not only in the West Bank, but from East Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Netanyahu said he wants control of Gaza. So this whole question, the difficulty is that until Israel says, we want to simply deal with Hamas and then withdraw from the occupied territories, that would be a different situation. Yeah. But it seems to be, at the moment, the Netanyahu government seems to be saying they want a greater Israel project, and the Palestinians will have to look after themselves in some other space. Yeah. Which is ethnic cleansing. They're basically uprooting people who are living in these territories. And that is why there is a sense of frustration. And that is why many commentators, in fact, there was two things. There was an investigation recently by the UN, but there was also the International Association of Genocide Scholars. And that's why Israel has found itself on the receiving end of accusations that it's engaging in genocide. So at the moment, it looks like, to many observers looking in, that Israel is trying to preempt the possibility of a Palestinian state by actually physically occupying the territories where a Palestinian state would be created. Yeah. And which is adding to the temperature, of course.
Now, the New York Declaration was critical, yes, of the actions of Israel in Gaza, but also, of course, the actions of Hamas on October the 7th, and recognising that this is a terrorist organisation, would have no part in a Palestinian state if it were recognised. But from what you're saying, it seems that in order for this theoretical idea of a Palestinian state to ever be a reality, that's certainly not going to happen with Hamas in control in Gaza, and probably not going to happen with Netanyahu in control in Israel.
Yeah, but the point is that up until the Hamas attack, Mr. Netanyahu had been supporting, through Qatar, Hamas. And why did Mr. Netanyahu support Hamas? Because he said it was publicly described as an asset of Israel because it kept the Palestinians divided, which, if you like, was consistent with his goal of denying Palestinian statehood. I think what Hamas did was appalling, and what Hamas basically have caused misery for many innocent Palestinians as a result of their actions. And the point is, how do you defang Hamas? Have Hamas been weakened by the actions of the last 24 months? Politically, they're not. And, even militarily, after 24 months of a relentless military onslaught, they still haven't been destroyed. It's a fantasy to believe that you can apply military pressure to solve a political problem. This is a political problem. Mm-hmm. And it's been going on since 1967. At some point, it may not be this Israeli leadership, but there will be an Israeli leadership in the future that can say, how can we best achieve the objective of security for Israel? They will have to recognize the right of political self-determination for the Palestinians to achieve that.
And to be fair, honestly, Israel does have peaceful relationships with some of its neighbours, Jordan perhaps being the best example of that.
Yes, but that is coming under pressure now after their attack in Qatar.
Yeah.
Qatar, which is a close American ally, America has its biggest base in Qatar. Mm-hmm. Israel, in the course of the last 24 months, has conducted preemptive attacks in 6 neighbouring countries.
Yeah.
And that's in flagrant violation of international law. We've just learned in the last 2 days that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have signed a mutual assistance agreement where they will come to each other's defense if one is attacked, and they hope to expand that agreement.
Yeah.
I think there are signs that you may say it's belated because the many Arab countries have remained remarkably mute while this terrible situation has unfolded, in which so many Palestinians and so many Israelis have suffered, but particularly the Palestinians and particularly the civilians. 18,000 Palestinian children have been killed in the last 2 years. So this situation is unacceptable. And unfortunately, the root cause, I think, is the failure of the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
And we need to revisit that.
And even certainly some commentators saying that what the UN is doing is setting back the peace process in that it is offering the prospect of a Palestinian state, which is what Hamas has been fighting for. But certainly the attack on Hamas leaders has also set back the peace process.
But let's be quite clear. Hamas does not have a monopoly on the vision of a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
I don't think many Palestinians want Hamas to be in control of them. They have no choice. But how do you defang an organization like Hamas? You give the opportunity to the moderate majority of Palestinians to form a state. If you deny them the pathway to a state, you are actually boosting the forces of extremism and terrorism. And that is the dilemma that the Israeli government faces at the moment.
Yeah.
I think many people outside Israel believe that Mr. Netanyahu's actions are not boosting Israel's security, that only a two-state solution can achieve that. But so far, we're a long way from that. Yeah. And politics is about difficult decisions. You could argue, what's the point of symbolically recognize that the Palestinians should have a state when there's no prospect of it happening on the ground?
Yeah.
But is that worse than actually saying, well, countries can just expand with impunity and take what they want because they have the power? In other words, countries can, if you like, the Netanyahu government can show that the principle of might is right, and that's fine. Well, that has big implications for everyone else. And so at some point, if you want a world based on rules, principles, and law, international law, then you sometimes have to take steps which don't have practical effect, but do try to preserve a system in which international relations is based on rules and principles.
Of course, before the end of the month, there will be a vote, and New Zealand has been, a little bit shy as to putting its hat in the ring on which way it will vote, whether or not to support a Palestinian state. Any instinct, Robert, on which way New Zealand will lean on this one?
Oh, I think my sense is that we've been quite coy about our decision-making if you look at New Zealand's track record, I think it's consistently supported a two-state solution. Mr. Peters is very unhappy about the fact the UN Security Council, in his words, has failed in its responsibilities. And thirdly, he's always argued that there's no military solution to a political problem.
Yeah.
He said from the outset, early on, once he was foreign minister, there was not going to be a military solution to this conflict between Hamas and the Israeli government. And I think they were wise words, and I think they will be borne out with time. But my sense is that New Zealand will join Britain, France, and Canada, and 142 other countries in recognising the need for a Palestinian state. It's about tough choices, Andrew. Just imagine if they keep delaying because the conditions are not right and the territories where the Palestinians live are effectively annexed. Then there'll be no prospect of a Palestinian state. So it's all about tough choices.
We appreciate your perspective, your insights in this matter. Robert, thank you so much once again for being on the program.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rabin studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.